So here is the clean sound. Hey, how's it going? So this is the Germanium version of the miniFUZZ. It features 2 Germanium transistors. It has an external bias control, external fuzz control, and obviously a volume control, which you can adjust with your foot if you need to while you're playing live. And it also has a 3-way toggle switch. Now on the Fat Full setting, it gives you that classic 60s fuzz tone, lots of warmth, lots of bass, and it cleans up really well. The Zonk setting is reminiscent of the 60s tone bender type tones, much more gritty, more mid-rangey. It cuts really well in the band, and if you use it on a very low bias setting or a very high bias setting, it gives you a lot of character. It almost adds a lot of grit to the tone. With a very low bias setting, it can actually sound slightly gated and slightly broken, so you can get some really interesting and cool sounds with that. The vintage setting is great if you've got maybe humbucker guitars, or you want to use different pickups. A lot of fuzz pedals have so much low end on them that if you're trying to use a neck pickup, it can become too mushy, or even a humbucker, it just gets a little bit too mushy. So on the vintage setting, it rolls off a lot of those lows and low mids, but retains that classic fuzz tone. Just makes it more usable in a band situation. So one of these standout and unique features of the miniFUZZ is the bias set light. As far as I know, this is the first time it's been done on a commercially available fuzz. So as a lot of you know, Germanium transistors sound incredible, but they are very, very sensitive to temperature changes. The original fuzz pedals actually didn't have a bias control. The bias was set internally. So if the temperature was right, the original Germanium transistors would sound fantastic. But as soon as you move to a different environment, maybe you played an outside stage or you were recording in an air-conditioned studio, suddenly the fuzz would sound very, very different. And in some situations, it would actually stop working altogether. So bringing the bias control to the outside of the pedal means that you can adjust for all kinds of different environments and different temperatures. So having the bias light actually takes all the guesswork out of setting the bias. It means no matter what environment you're playing in, whether it's an air-conditioned studio or a hot stage, you can always see where the bias is ideally set. Gives you great consistency in tone. It means that you always know that you're going to get the tone that you expect out of the pedal, and it's not going to change from show to show. You don't have to always set the bias with the light on, but it at least gives you a reference as to where the perfect bias point is. So here is the clean sound. So first of all, let's look at the bias control. Now the bias control can have a really strong effect on the tone. Very low bias settings can sound slightly gated and quite gritty, and high bias settings can sound kind of overdriven, almost like an overdrive. It's actually quite a classic kind of 60s tone with it full. I quite like it. So if we roll the bias up until the bias light comes on, this will give us the classic fuzz tone, and it sounds like this. This is the fuzz set halfway. So here is the clean sound. If we start to move the bias down, we can start to get kind of a broken up sound. So we'll move it really low down and see what we can get. So if we use the bias light like a home setting, we always know that when the bias light is on, we've got that classic vintage sound. However, there's really cool and interesting sounds to explore outside of this range. So we can use the light as a reference point. Now this reference point will change as the temperature changes, so it gives you a good idea of where your settings are going to be each night. It just really takes the guesswork out of it. So I've always found with the bias set very high, the fuzz will sound more like an overdrive, and it's actually quite a classic 60s kind of sound. So here's the clean sound. So let's explore the zonk setting. So the zonk setting is kind of reminiscent of some of the 60s kind of tone bendery type tones. And these are a little bit more broken up and a little bit more gritty, very distinctive tones, kind of cream style leads. So let's look at these. Now, I find that the zonk setting actually works really well, either with a very high bias or a very low bias setting. So this is the clean tone. So you can hear it's got a almost a very mid-rangey kind of a very interesting character to the tone. So let's try it on a very low bias setting and see how that changes. So I found when you're using the original 60s fuzz pedals that if you're trying to use a neck pickup or a humbucker pickup, it can just get too mushy and lost in the low end. If you're trying to play it in a band, it almost gets completely lost. So with the vintage setting, it actually takes away some of that rumbly low end and sort of low mids, and it allows you to use a middle pickup or a neck pickup or a humbucker without the complete loss of clarity. So here's the neck pickup on the vintage setting. So here's the clean sound. So for me, that really makes so much difference in a band situation where that would get completely lost, and it still allows you to have a little bit of bite left in it. So let's talk about the fuzz control. You can get some almost overdrive type sounds with very low settings. So I'm going to turn the volume up a little bit. So here's the clean sound. So let's look at some settings with the fuzz set to full. So this is the clean sound. So there's plenty of fuzz there if you need it. So a lot of you are probably already aware of the clean tones that you can get from a fuzz pedal, and I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive. So for me, I put the volume on full and the fuzz on around halfway, but there's no definite set way to do it. And you just roll the volume on your guitar down just a little bit. So I'm going to set it down to 8 on my guitar. And this kind of gives you a clean, a slightly glassy, very pure and very playable clean tone. So this is with the guitar volume rolled down to 8. So this is with the guitar volume rolled down a little bit further. It gets a little softer, but you still get that bright sort of chimey top end coming through. So a lot of players actually use that on all the time for their clean tone. So one last thing, if you have a treble bleed capacitor in your guitar, it basically means that when you roll your guitar down, it actually keeps some of the top end. I know a lot of people have it already added in. On my guitar, I have it on a switch, so those sounds are with it off. If you turn it on and you're using a fuzz, you can get like super bright and glassy sounds. It's actually very, very cool. So this is with the treble bleed and the fuzz with the volume rolled down. So it'd be quite fun to play with those really, really glassy sounds. So this pedal actually has 3 internal options. It has 2 switches. One of them allows you to adjust the amount of bass that the pedal has. The original fuzz pedals had quite a lot of bass rolled off them, so they could sound a little thin at times. So the vintage setting will be the classic vintage sound, and the full range setting gives you an extended low end, which I personally really like. The other setting is for either vintage or boost, so if you've used a vintage fuzz pedal, you'll often have seen people running it at full volume, because the old vintage fuzz pedals didn't have a lot of output volume. So in here there's an internal switch for vintage or boost. So the vintage is the classic vintage circuit, and boost gives you a lot of output, so you can actually drive your tube amp, and you have a lot more volume to boost for solos. So you might have tried to power other fuzz pedals before with a DC socket, and notice that it's either very noisy or just doesn't sound as good. So we've built a battery simulator into here. So if you're powering the pedal from a plug-in DC power jack, it'll sound much more like a battery. So you can either power it with a battery, with a DC jack. Alternatively, if you want to power the pedal from an external battery box, you can change the jumper setting on here, so the battery box connects directly to the circuit, just like the internal battery. Cool, thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. If you think I've left anything out, or if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much, bye.